Colleagues, we want to open this meeting of our Foreign Affairs Committee and International Development pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the study of Canada's Development Finance Initiative. So this morning, in the first hour, in front of us is the Centre for International Governance Innovation, and it's Mr. Medora, the President. He's on video conferencing from Waterloo, Ontario, which is a really nice riding, I hear. As well from Oxfam Canada, Francesca Rhodes, Women's Rights Policy and Advocacy Specialist. Welcome to Francesca. And Lauren Ravon,
thank you.
Director of Policy and Campaigns. So welcome to the committee. Congratulations for getting through security. It's always a hassle this time of the year, I understand. So what we're going to do is go to our witnesses for opening comments. And so we'll start with Mr. Medora, and then we'll move, give you guys from Oxfam an opportunity to catch your breath, and then you'll go second, and then we'll go into questions from the committee members. So, Mr. Medora, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair. Good morning, members and colleagues. The organization I head, CG, has been working on the broad area of finance and development finance for several years. We've published a number of papers. And I have spent the better part of 3 decades, first at the International Development Research Centre and previously at the University of Toronto working on the subject. So it's a privilege to be with you and to be able to speak with you on the subject. In the 7-ish minutes I have, I thought I'd do 3 things, and then we can always have a conversation thereafter, which is to have comments that start with the concept and then bleed into the construct of the organization and then the operation of the proposed DFI. I guess I'd begin by saying that the DFI for Canada is a good and timely idea, mainly because it's in keeping with the transition worldwide from development assistance to development partnerships. So that is a good thing. However, globally, capital shortage is not the problem. There is ample capital for investable opportunities. Rather, it's the know-how for making sound investments that is often what is lacking. And so the main thrust of my comments is going to be that what goes along with the finance is at least as important as the finance itself. Now, that's important to note because the capitalization and therefore the potential lending capacity of Canada's DFI is quite small. In fact, frankly, it's puny. $300 million over 5 years is going to be what? About 50, 60 million annually, perhaps. And just to give you a benchmark, the International Finance Corporation, which is the multilateral institution that is broadly in the same business, has an annual outlay of $10 billion US. The Nordic Investment Bank, which works in both the Nordic countries and overseas, has an annual outlay of $3.5 billion. So Canada's DFI, if it wishes to punch above its weight, has its work cut out for it. So I guess my first point here would be that growth and expansion of the DFI should be inbuilt from the start, and it should be related to benchmarks of success. And we can certainly discuss what those benchmarks might be, but growth and expansion connected to benchmarks makes sense. Since the DFI is going to be funded from the EDC's revenues, one thought is that over time, a higher proportion of the EDC revenues might be devoted to the DFI, and this way, the expansion of the DFI is not a net call on the public exchequer in Canada. At the end of the day, this is meant to be a private sector-ish activity. Focus by region or theme when you're this small is also going to be important. And there's a number of ways that we can be looking at this. The leverage ratio, meaning the amount of other dollars that the DFI's activities will crowd in, is currently, I am told, set at about 5-to-1. And my suggestion to you would be that this should be a minimum. In fact, the IFC's leverage ratio is 7-to-1. And in an era where private sector capital outnumbers public money by many factors, I think 5-to-1 is modest, but it is a very good start. This, however, has to be compensated for by other forms of assistance, as I said, that go with finance, and we might want to think about what that is. Is it technical assistance? Is it capacity building in sound lending? Is it market research and promotion? Is it technology transfer? I don't know, but it seems to me that these are the kinds of issues we should be talking about. The second aspect of focus has to do with what exactly the DFI lends about or on. And here again, it's an open field. One thought is to stay within current ODA priorities, which would mean working in industries that work in the maternal and child health sector or perhaps extractives. The other thought is to go completely in the opposite direction and to complement Canada's efficient development assistance program by investing in areas that are outside its ambit. Green tech comes to mind, new technologies more broadly, funding startups. I'm from Waterloo, so that resonates with me. And finally, it occurred to me last week when I was listening to the Minister unveil Canada's new feminist foreign aid policy that perhaps investing in women's entrepreneurship or in organizations or firms led by women or primarily concerned with producing products and services for women and children might be the way to go. So I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that choices have to be made and have to be made early. My final set of comments has to do with the operationalization of the DFI. And here I should sound a cautionary note in the sense that the institutionalization of the DFI within the EDC is not ideal. The main reason it's not ideal is because the trade promotion and export promotion corporate culture is not the same as the banking culture, and it's not the same as the development culture. The skill sets, the ethos, and the objectives that each of these requires is different. And I do fear that unless care is not taken to situate the DFI appropriately within the EDC, it might not be fully effective. In fact, when I read, and I've been associated in some ways and been following the development of the DFI for some time, my first reaction was that this is a situation that cries out for the Crown Corporation setup, which Canada does so well. Crown corporations are independent. They provide good governance, diversity in partnerships, and effectiveness, and that's all inbuilt through their board and their operating structure. In fact, one of the committee's questions to us was to ask how this might connect with IDRC. Now, that's a very good example of an independent Crown corporation, small but extremely effective, precisely because it's had the Crown Corporation structure. The Montreal location of the DFI, I think, also poses a question in my mind, which is I believe that the logic of situating the DFI within EDC was to generate economies of scale in things like shared services, location, and staff. But if EDC is headquartered in Ottawa and the DFI is in Montreal, I would wonder to what extent the economies of scale from shared services would be, in fact, achieved. And so my final thought is that this is a good idea. It must be nurtured. How it starts is exactly important in terms of how it develops and ends. Keep the operation small but technical and professional. Do not Christmas tree it with lots of vague objectives that don't add up. But if we get it right, this will be a feather in both Canada's cap and also good for the developing world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Medora. Now we'll go to Ms. Rhodes, please, from Oxfam.
So thank you for the opportunity to share Oxfam's thoughts on the new Development Finance Initiative. Oxfam is an international confederation working in 90 countries to support long-term development and provide humanitarian assistance. We also do advocacy and campaigns to address the root causes of poverty. We put women's rights and gender justice at the heart of everything we do. The new DFI is an opportunity to be innovative and to leverage finance for poverty reduction and gender equality, but Canada will need to be bold in how it is designed in order to ensure that these goals are met. Private finance should never be a replacement or substitute for aid. However, if designed carefully and in alignment with Canada's new feminist international assistance policy, the DFI could add important contributions towards achieving these same goals. Oxfam recognises that the private sector has the potential to significantly contribute to sustainable development. The private sector, of course, comprises a multitude of actors, including those which often offer employment opportunities for women in rural and poorer contexts, such as cooperatives, micro and small enterprises. With a vibrant, thriving, accountable and responsible private sector, there are greater possibilities for sustainable development and economic growth that can lead to poverty reduction and reduced inequality. However, the experience of other development financing facilities shows that without a strong alignment with the goals and strategies of sustainable development, public-backed private finance can fail to reach its potential contribution and in some cases reinforce existing inequalities. The DFI should avoid these pitfalls by starting with a strong mandate to reduce poverty and to complement the government's feminist international assistance policy. So we have 5 recommendations in order to do this. So the first recommendation is that the DFI's mandate should align with development effectiveness principles and focus on additionality. In order to ensure alignment with sustainable development, the DFI should conform to the principles of development effectiveness, particularly country ownership, transparency, and accountability. Globally, civil society has called for much greater transparency and accountability of DFIs. The Canadian DFI should consider how it will address this, including through complying with the International Aid Transparency Initiative, which several other DFIs, including the Dutch, FMO, and UK CDC, already comply with. How the DFI will measure and report on its goal of contributing to poverty reduction should be thought of in the early stages. The DFI should focus on maximising the additionality that it brings to Canada's development strategy. This can be thought of as financial additionality, where the public and private actors together are bringing additional funding, through development additionality, where there is greater sustainable development impact as the result of public and private finance working together, or value additionality, where the public actor is bringing something that wouldn't otherwise be present, such as a focus on poverty reduction, sustainability, or gender equality. The 3 main pillars of the Official Development Assistance Accountability Act also provide a strong framework that can be drawn on for the DFI's mandates. The DFI currently is not counted as ODA, and so it's not subject to the same principles, but the same principles would be useful to apply to the DFI. So that is that they should ensure to contribute to poverty reduction, to take into account the perspectives of the poor, and to be consistent with international human rights standards. A second recommendation is that the DFI's investment strategy should be strategically aligned with Canada's new feminist international assistance policy. Ensuring close alignment with global affairs and a feminist international assistance policy is key to ensure strategic investments that contribute to development. It would also show that Canada is learning from the experience of other bilateral institutions. When independently evaluated, the UK DFID's private sector investments were criticised for not being aligned with their objectives for poverty reduction and for lacking strategic oversight, clear objectives, and demonstrating additionality. On the other hand, the Finnish DFI, FinFund, has aligned its investments with the priorities of their aid strategy, so focusing on green technologies and telecommunications. As Canada's new feminist international assistance policy focuses on a feminist approach to ending poverty, the DFI should complement this and do the same. This, in practice, will require working closely with global affairs to develop complementary and focused strategies, sharing expertise and intelligence about development priorities and particular contexts in which they're both operating. The DFI could also consider designing its governance structure so that accountability is not just to EDC, but to ministers in global affairs as well. Our third recommendation is to ensure that the DFI has the capacity and expertise to both mainstream gender equality throughout its work and also to provide targeted investments that benefit women and girls. In designing any development policy or programme, a gender analysis is essential to ensure that women and girls benefit equally and that gender inequality is not inadvertently reinforced. The DFI should ensure that it seeks to build its own expertise and capacity, as well as that of its partners, in order to be able to meet this goal. This is another important area we're working with closely with global affairs will be key. Women's organisations and experts should also be included in the design of investments. The new Feminist International Assistance Policy commits all of Canada's development partners to consult with local women's organisations when designing interventions, which is a powerful principle to ensure that they are guided by their priorities and concerns. The DFI should also ensure that when it is gathering information about the context of the investments being made, through any consultations or advisory bodies that are set up, the women's organisations are included and able to provide their expertise. Our fourth recommendation is that the DFI should have robust monitoring and accountability systems and should only involve companies that respect human rights, including women's rights. The DFI must commit to do no harm, ensuring that investments are assessed and monitored for their impact on human rights and women's rights in particular. Oxfam's research into the World Bank's private sector arm has documented instances of violence against women, land grabs, and other disturbing outcomes of private sector development projects. The DFI needs to put in place robust monitoring and accountability frameworks that identify and prevent any negative impact on groups marginalised based on gender or sexual orientation, including changes in livelihood, likelihood of violence, access to assets, and labour rights. The DFI should also ensure that jobs created through its investments are decent jobs, that investment partners and contractors respect labour standards, and that measures are in place to avoid discrimination. Currently, EDC does not have a human rights policy, but it has a statement on human rights that was issued in 2008. This should be updated to a policy, and staff should be trained to implement it. The DFI should also consider putting in place accountability mechanisms, for example, setting up an independent complaint mechanism which is accessible to local communities involved in the investments. The Dutch FMO's independent mechanism, which was set up in consultation with civil society, would be a good example to follow. Another aspect of do no harm is ensuring that private sector finance is not a substitute for public financing of essential services that are accessible to the poorest. The DFI should not seek to increase private sector involvement in the provision of public services. The DFI should only partner with companies who pay taxes on the value created in developing countries that they operate in. Oxfam research into the World Bank's private sector lending in 2015 showed that 51 out of 68 companies that received loans to finance investments in sub-Saharan Africa were using tax havens, which was denying those countries much-needed public funds. Our final recommendation is that the DFI should invest in projects aimed at reducing gender inequality and that benefit women and girls. Going beyond the do no harm to be truly transformative, the DFI should set the goal of making investments that address gender equality and enable women and girls to benefit from development. Women and girls often do not benefit from development due to their heavy and unequal responsibility for unpaid care and domestic work. On average, women are responsible for 2.5 times more hours of unpaid care and domestic work than men. Using the DFI to leverage investments that help reduce this burden would be a powerful way to address a structural barrier to women's full and equal participation in the economy. For example, infrastructure projects can be designed to reduce the time women spend fetching water or fuel or transporting dependents, but only if a gender analysis is included in their design and women are consulted on their needs. Another approach would be to catalyse investments in time and labour-saving technologies and ensure that these are available in rural and poorer areas. Oxfam has been working on small-scale projects in Ethiopia, Uganda and Zimbabwe that connect communities with fuel-efficient stoves, which both reduce time fetching fuel, cooking, and are also far safer to use. Making these types of investments would be a truly innovative way to address gender inequality. The DFI should also prioritise financial service programmes for women-led small and medium enterprises. The DFI could look at making sure loan guarantees are available for women-led small and medium enterprises, and generally these are at a disadvantage in attracting credit due to women being less likely to own collateral or due to harmful social norms. It could also offer technical assistance to financial institutions and businesses to train women entrepreneurs. I believe Engineers Without Borders provided testimony with further details on proposals in these areas last week, which we support. To conclude, Oxfam does not believe that the DFI should act as a substitute for ODA, and the DFI should not be using ODA allocations. However, the DFI has potential to complement the work of Global Affairs and the new Feminist International Assistance Policy if its aims and objectives are aligned, and to set a new standard for development finance contributing to sustainable development. We hope the committee will consider these recommendations to help ensure the DFI is bold and innovative and reaching its goal of reducing poverty and gender inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rhodes. We're going to go straight to questions, and we'll start with Mr. Allison, please.
Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Barr, my question to you, you've studied these, you've looked at a lot of them over a variety of countries. Talk to us about, you did say there's a number of options that we could look at, but in your opinion, and seeing what's out there, what's been done well, and where Canada has its strengths, what would you recommend that we look at as a focus? I realize ultimately the minister will decide and the mandate will come there, but in your experience and seeing what goes on and where we have our ability to have excellence, where would you suggest that we focus our our mandate on this particular DFI.
So was the question directed at me?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
Oh, sorry. I would recommend that, on the one hand, you have needs at the other end, and on the other hand, you have the expertise in the source country. And I think we have to be guided by what Canada does best. We have to be guided by what we have said we will avowedly want to change. And it strikes me that there's two or three things. I thought that the unveiling of the feminist foreign aid policy was inspired last week, but then one has to put flesh around it. And so it seems to me that focusing on women's entrepreneurship is something that Canada has done, and it is something that we could give focus to through this. I also think that since one of the biggest issues facing developing countries and indeed globally is changes in the environment, anything that promotes green technology might be something worth doing. This is an area in which Canada is rapidly becoming dominant. It creates wealth, but more importantly, with technology, what you find is that there are spillover effects, which other witnesses have also pointed to, so that you would find that you're sort of at the same time inspiring universities and other sectors in developing countries to grow. So I would think some combination of working with new technologies, green technologies, and having a social bent, say through women's entrepreneurship, might be the way to go.
Do you have any thoughts around rates of return? We got a chance to hear from our colleagues from the UK, and as has been mentioned, I think through testimony, that there's been some issues. They've had some resets in the UK over the last 50, 60 years. So what are your thoughts? I mean, I'm assuming we're looking at it for the long game. So around rates of return and those kinds of things, do you have any thoughts?
The way the IFC and other multilateral institutions, and indeed the CDC in the UK works, is that there's a private rate of return, which is the financial rate of return, and then they try and compute something called the social rate of return, which is an attempt to capture those wider gains to society from investment. Usually, although this is not in every case, but a good long-term sort of benchmark is to say that the social rate of return should be at least twice as high as the private rate of return, and the private rate of return should be about twice as high as the long-term real rate of interest in a country. If I put that down, I'd say if you achieve 5 to 7% private rates of return and 12 to 15% social rates of return, you're doing very well. In fact, you might be beating the international average here. But your point about the long-term nature is an important one, because if you choose to go in something like green technology, which is highly risky, it may take time to achieve that rate of return, and you have to be tolerant of a lot of failure, just as we have in this country with startups, to find that those one or two successful firms.
And the last question, in terms of you talked about capitalization. You talked about how it's a small amount, and you suggested, was it 5 to 1? May make some sense in terms of leveraging some of those dollars. I just want to clear, or I heard 7 to 1 and 5 to 1. So your thoughts around, just expand a bit more on that. I mean, are we talking about going to the market for bonds? Are we talking about just borrowing the money? What are the thoughts on trying to help this organization create some capacity?
Right. So, I mean, these are sort of off-the-cuff figures, but let's say $300 million over 5 years. And let's assume that the operating costs are modest. So let's say all the $300 million, if you divide it by 5, that gives you $60 million annually. If you then have a 5 to 1 leveraging ratio, you want to raise another $300 million or so annually to give you $350, $400 million lending capacity. There's two ways you can do it, and they're not mutually exclusive. One is to have the DFI itself float bonds, and in fact, raise the money itself overall and then use the money as it sees fit through its various project investments. The second way, and the IFC operates this way as well, is on a project-by-project basis to go out and look for other partners. The latter is more labor-intensive, but it is often more effective because it gets you the right partnerships in each case. And bear in mind what I said, that it's not just the money, it's the non-financial expertise that often makes or breaks these kinds of projects. So early on, I think the DFI will have to make a choice. And if it wishes to float a bond, I think there would be demand for it. There would be institutional investors who could be tempted into doing it. That would increase its core lending capacity. And then on a project-by-project basis, it could achieve the rest of the leverage.
Thank you.
Greg Escados, please.
Chair, and thank you to all of you for your testimony today. Mr. Medhora, I want to ask a question to you first. We have heard from a number of witnesses, in fact it was mentioned today, that poverty reduction ought to be strongly considered as far as a mandate focus. Looking at that is something that would help avoid the DFI simply from investing in areas that will not help to address problems of underdevelopment. However, and at first blush, that makes absolute sense. The devil is in the details, I think. And I want to ask you a question about how we measure poverty. And I've read articles that you've put forward that present nuances in this regard. For instance, you've written that poverty can be measured simply by looking at per capita income levels, or you can measure it according to the multidimensional poverty index, which looks at a broader range of factors: nutrition levels, years of schooling, clean water access, housing. And so I point to that nuance because if you look at two countries that you've, I read a Globe and Mail op-ed in preparation for this meeting. You talked about India and Uzbekistan. In India, a country that is quickly emerging as not just a global player, but when it comes to the economy, a leading player. You could look at per capita income levels there and be quite impressed. But if you measure indicators along the lines of the multidimensional index, nutrition levels, years of schooling, literacy levels, and the like, India is actually quite poor compared to Uzbekistan, where you have low per capita income levels, but on the multidimensional index measures, they do much better. And so with that in mind, I want to ask you, what would you, if Canada was to go ahead and put poverty reduction into the mandate of the DFI, could you tell us some cautionary notes, perhaps, about how we measure poverty? Because it's not simply a matter of investing in countries that are poor. We have to understand how we measure poverty, and how should, if we do decide, in fact, to include poverty reduction into the mandate of the DFI, how should we measure poverty? By looking at per capita income levels, by looking at the multidimensional poverty index, or some other measure?
Thank you. That is, in some ways, exactly the right dilemma that we face. There's a number of things that one would want to unpack about this. What I guess I would say is that this goes to my last point about not Christmas treeing the DFI with objectives that are all valid and make us feel good. But if they're not verifiable, or more importantly in this case, if you cannot connect an outcome to the activity of the DFI, then it is a bit of a mug's game to say that, well, it is our $50 million investment that resulted in this change. That is why also, by the way, about the time that I wrote that op-ed, some of us, although we consider ourselves development friendly, we're skeptical about the Foreign Aid Accountability Act, which I know several of my colleagues in the development business supported, simply because of the measurability and the connection issue. So I guess I would say, give the DFI a mandate to achieve development. Recognize that development is more than reducing income poverty, that, as you pointed out, the Human Development Index, at the very least, which the UNDP measures and propagates every year, has other dimensions to it, of which health and education and the gender elements of these are important, and that there may be cases. In fact, my colleague gave the example of not investing in infrastructure if this is if this is already publicly provided for the very poor. That may well be, but ask yourself, suppose the DFI invested in a green, the way they have in Stockholm, a green train line between the airport and the city, or connecting suburbs to a city, which in fact poor people would use. I would argue that anecdotally, this is a good investment to make, and it's good for development. But if then someone asked me, show that this investment resulted in a reduction in poverty, either narrowly or widely defined, I'd be hard-pressed to do so. In fact, 3/4 of my organization would just be writing reports trying to convince folks about that. So I think we're going to need some judgment and common sense, and this is why I'm arguing for a small Crown Corporation-like professional organization staffed by experts who we should give the mandate because we trust what they're doing.
Thank you very much to Ms. Rhodes or Ms. Raven. If Canada does go down the road of putting in the DFI's mandate the objective of poverty reduction, how should we measure poverty?
Maybe I'll just jump in on a couple of these points. I think the issue of measuring poverty and well-being is an interesting one. And for example, something that Francesca touched upon is time use. So we see that women who enter the formal economy might have a marginal gain in income, but less time. And so there's issues that there's time poverty that's worsened. Or for example, if you're going far distances to be able to access your job, the risks on the travel, the risk to your family, the lack of childcare for your children, you're actually more impoverished than empowered. So I think a simple equation of economic opportunity and empowerment is definitely the wrong way to go. And so we would definitely consider looking way beyond family income as the only measure of poverty. But I also think that the issue of investing in public services that are specific to women's time use is an interesting one, and one where Canada could be doing a lot of good work. I think the issue of transportation, when we look at a gender analysis around transportation, we see that for example, the roads or the public transportation that men use is often not the same as women. So they'll be using the higher, for example, the highways in a country or the larger routes, whereas women will be using smaller back roads and country roads. And so looking at where we're doing those investments does make a difference. Something to consider. And then time use technologies, things like stoves she talked about, but clean energy, linking it to a gender analysis is probably where Canada can have one of the best fits, in the sense that a lot of the clean technology is actually directed at women because they're the ones that use those at the home level and at the community level.
Yeah, and just to sum up, if it wasn't obvious already, but perhaps it bears emphasis, the reason I'm asking this is that at some point, if poverty reduction is included in the mandate of the DFI, there could be a situation where, we're looking at, or the DFI is looking at, investing in India or investing in a place like Uzbekistan, to use those two examples. One might argue that, well, India is doing quite well already on a number of indicators, namely per capita income. Why would you want to go there? Go to Uzbekistan, where you have a very low per capita income, but you look at different measures like the poverty index that I've talked about, and you get a completely different picture, a very, very different picture that says that you ought to, in fact, go against what might appear as common sense. And so that's why I wanted to put it forward. Thank you very much to both of you for answering the question. Countries
of focus. We've moved in terms of Oxfam from investing only in the poorest countries to looking at the criteria of inequality. So in middle-income countries, we have poorer communities than we've seen in the past, and looking at what is driving that gap in inequality in those countries is actually of greater concern in the long run than only focusing on poverty where it is today, but seeing those gaps widen. And so middle-income countries could be a place to invest. It's just where in the country and in what communities, obviously.
Thank you very much.
We'll go to Mr. Aubin, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. It seems that you're giving precious help in going from concept to reality. Since the beginning of our study, the two concepts, which seem to be unanimously accepted, the relevance of DFIs and the concept of additionality. But if you take the concept of a DFI, a Canadian DFI, $60 million a year, that would mean that the DFI would have minimal capacity. You even question the fact that this institute would be in Montreal, which, according to you, would lead to additional costs in terms of administration and operation, which wouldn't leave as much money for aid on the ground. And it's important that they generate revenue quickly in order to increase its capacity, and that means risk capital. It seems that so far we've been regressing every year. Before it was 0.28, then 24, and then a little bit below that we had a Minister of Finance who said we had to learn to do more with less. So this concept of additionality, it seems we're making cuts everywhere. Is there truly, in the Canadian model, is there something we can truly do with these two instruments that have been proposed to us, but with very few resources at their disposal? Perhaps first to Oxfam, then Mr. Medora. Well, I don't know if the translation system was working, but a priori, we're a little bit skeptical until we see proof. We have to see that this investment will help to reduce poverty. We haven't seen that yet. We do see a great emphasis on the importance of reducing poverty and on the rights of women. It might not make things any better because it would allow us to act more cautiously and invest in things, more specific things, and with a restrained mandate. Especially if we look at the financial participation of women. When we look at poverty with women and girls, we might just invest in that, but starting small might help us to avoid certain problems. We've seen where a lot of money has been put into something, but where there have been a lot of problems. So we have a kind of skeptical optimism with regard to investment in development, and we know that Global Affairs is asking for proof as to results and wants us to be specific as to what we do with our money. So with respect to the DFI, well, they would have to show the same accountability as we do. Mr. Medora.
I think those are very good observations embedded in the question, and I share some of the points that my colleague from Oxfam made. I guess my first point would be that in an era, whether we like it or not, but in an era of stagnant and perhaps even declining ODA, and by the way, there are good reasons for it. The fact is the emerging developing countries now have capacities to fund development that they did not have 40 and 50 years ago when we conceived our aid programs. But in any case, given that kind of stagnancy, creating an instrument that crowds in other private sector funding is surely a good thing. So, I mean, that's one point I'd make. The second point I'd make is that, as my colleague said, starting small is okay, especially in the early years. You're going to want to sort of make a few mistakes, learn from them, and then build. So my point is starting small is okay, but build into the growth of this organization benchmarks that allow it to grow and prosper so that it becomes a larger proportion of Canada's overseas assistance. And on the third point about are we expecting any more or less of this organization than we are of Canadian organizations who work in the development sphere, my sense is it should be about the same, but my real sense is that we might want to lower some of the burden of reporting on Canadian development organizations rather than simply say, let's have the same burden on everyone. So I think also being a humanitarian agency is different than being a bank. So the nature of the reporting is going to be different too. But when you add all of that together, I am optimistic about this. I don't mean to suggest that because it's small, it's not going to be effective. And the example I'd give you, by the way, is exactly my former employer, IDRC. IDRC is about 4% of Canada's ODA. And in fact, in terms of global ODA flows, it would be about 1/25 of that. And yet, as I think you all would know, because you've had people from IDRC at your table, it is one of the jewels in Canada's overseas presence and has been a hugely effective agency over time.
Merci. J'avais une autre question pour Madame Rhodes.
I have another question for Ms. Rhodes. In your presentation, you slipped in, or rather you suggested that we follow the Dutch model, which you didn't really expatiate on that subject. I'd like you to explain what we should follow within the Dutch model.
Accountability, which the Dutch FMO set up in very close consultation with civil society organisations, including Oxfam, the Dutch affiliate in Oxfam. So it's set up as an independent mechanism which communities which are affected by investments made by the FMO can go and take any concerns or complaints to be able to experience that accountability. But yes, it was Oxfam were quite closely involved, and I'm happy to speak to our Dutch colleagues and find out exactly how it was designed and how it's been operating and the lessons learned, and bring those back as well.
Merci.
See, Ms. Aubin. Yeah, I think that's it. Then we'll go to Mr. Levitt, please.
Good morning, everyone. I want to come to you for a second, Ms. Rhodes, or both of you, actually. And I want to kind of go a little bit higher level, a little bit of a more macro look. We've heard from other witnesses earlier on in the study the concern about placing too many constraints or expectations that will constrain the private sector investment and turn it from being a DFI into something that, again, starts looking more like ODA. Particularly as it relates, and Ms. Rhodes, you raised a lot of suggestions around how this can tie into our international development priorities, which were very clearly articulated by Minister Bibeau just under a week ago. Is there a level, a percentage level that you think can be set aside to deal particularly with projects focusing on women and girls? Do you think this is something that should apply across the board to the full budget or annual allotment that's in the DFI? How do we still keep this as a thriving, functioning tool to bring projects in that might not have happened otherwise, but also stay true to some of our development, or stay true to our development objectives? So all of the learning from working to try and achieve gender equality through development is that you need to have both standalone projects which target women and girls, but you also need to make sure to mainstream gender equality throughout the program. So you need to have a gender analysis of any program which you're implementing to ensure that women and girls will be able to benefit equally from that. So I wouldn't say that there's the focus on women and girls is going to be a discrete part of the DFI's mandate, but it needs to be able to learn from the experiences of global affairs and the development community globally. That is core to be able to achieve in its goals. I would say that the focus on the idea to focus on women entrepreneurs, for example, is a good idea, and there are definitely examples and ways that can be done. But women do experience the economy in a broad range of ways. Not all women are entrepreneurs. Women are in the labour market. Women are not in the labour market for various reasons as well. So it's about thinking, how can we use this opportunity and this type of financing to be addressing some of those issues? And I think the experiences of other countries as well with their development finance initiatives are that the evaluations show that when they are working very much towards the same strategies and the same goals in a focused way. So it does mean making choices. Canada has chosen to focus on a feminist approach and to focus on targeting women and girls, so it would make sense for the DFI to also focus on that approach as well. And that
when the DFI and the donor agency are working together towards the same goals, and that's much more strategic than to be working on separate strategies, but sometimes in the same country, but working on very separate issues and things which aren't linked together, which is much less effective.
Yeah, just to jump in on that, we're thrilled that Canada has decided to take on a women's rights and feminist approach in its international programming. So this is great. But the private sector has been at this for a long time. They know that investing in women is there's good rates of return. It's good for GDP. It's good for the economy. The private sector usually makes the business case. We make the human rights case, but we're still going in the same direction. So I don't think that encouraging private investments in women is going to be the hardest one, in the sense that there is a profit to be made there, certainly, and the potential for growth is huge. I was wondering if Francesca wanted to speak to a specific example with Goldman Sachs, a DFI-related program with Goldman Sachs on women's entrepreneurship, because it shows that companies are willing to invest and there are good rates of return on these sort of investments.
Sure. So this is a partnership between the World Bank's IFC and Goldman Sachs. It's called 10,000 Women, and it's a program which aims to reach 10,000 women, small and medium enterprises with finance products, but then also with training and mentorship. And it's been running for a number of years, and I think all the evaluations have shown much stronger businesses which have been invested in, and job creation, and also that the women who have had the training and mentorship have reported really strong results from that. So it's just one example of how you can direct this type of finance towards women and girls.
Thank you. Before I move to Mr. Medhora, just one quick follow-up question, because I know it's an area of focus and strength for organizations like Oxfam, civil society organizations. The importance of local actors, to achieving positive outcomes, to being able to get information back in terms of whether we're meeting the needs and hitting the mark on some of these projects. What do you hear on the ground from case studies of successful DFI initiatives and successful projects that have really stood out for you? What is the importance of local actors?
So firstly, the first thing to note is that overall there is a real lack of evidence and documentation globally on DFI activities, and a lack of transparency is something which civil society have been raising time and time and again. So that's why at this moment we are calling as well for this DFI to make sure that it is open and transparent and can set the goals of what it's trying to achieve, and then be able to report on them as well. Involving local actors, as you said, and we'd particularly advocate to involve women's organisations to make sure that you're bringing their expertise into designing the investments is, of course, essential to be able to design them in line with the priorities of that context as well. If you want to be able to support women entrepreneurs in Kenya, then the best people to go and speak to will be the membership bodies of women entrepreneurs in Kenya, and go and ask them what the context is and what is needed and how those investments should be designed. So time and again, consultation with local actors is, of course, the best way to design any intervention.
Thank you, Mr. Levitt. We'll have to go to Mr. McKay, please. John?
You have to go to me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I also want to, but you go. I don't have to, but we'll talk about that later.
Thank you for your charitable intentions. Thank you all to your witnesses. As the sponsor and author of the Better Aid Bill, which is Canada's only legislated mandate for ODA, I have a sort of a parental and protective interest in seeing that the principles of the bill are incorporated into this entity, and hence I do like your idea of poverty reduction being the focus of this financial institution. The reason for the bill in the first place is that governments wander, ministers wander. We put aid money into all kinds of projects having absolutely nothing to do with poverty reduction, but tried to dress it up as poverty reduction. So I thought the conversation as to what is poverty is an interesting conversation, but if you don't start at first principles, that the point of this entire exercise is poverty reduction, then you will be subject to the whims of any government or any minister. So I buy your core point. The second issue, and I want to pursue this discussion, is that feminism has rightly been, if you will, woven into the government's approach, and it's a good idea. The issue is that if, in fact, you start to pursue smaller projects, you will up your overhead considerably. If you're doing mentorship, if you're doing expertise provision, and if you are upping your overhead per dollar loaned, you are either going to have fewer dollars loaned, or you are going to possibly have to go to market rates, which are highly inflationary, or you're going to have to recapitalize on a regular basis. So I'd be interested in both of your comments as to the possible unintended or unanticipated consequences of focusing on small and medium-sized loans, which will inevitably cut you out of the highly profitable other loans.
Maybe I can start and Francesca can follow. I mean, one thing is that we have to look at these investments. If they were highly profitable, the private sector would be investing in them on their own. This is because they need a boost, they need some encouragement. So we're not looking at the same kind of investments that the private sector would making in any case.
Maybe I misstated it by saying highly profitable. I just say...
Of course, but the issue of overhead is an important one, and I think I might be going out on a limb. I don't know if this has been done in other DFIs, and Francesca and our other colleague can speak to this, but there is something to be said about aligning the goals of our aid portfolio and the DFI. And so, for example, in last week's announcement, there was an announcement that Canada will be investing $150 million in local women's rights organizations. So you can see a strategy where, for example, in any given country, you have investments in women's rights organizations through our aid programs, strengthening, for example, Women's Entrepreneurship Association, women's cooperatives, all the rest, and then have an investment in the same communities where you already have a strengthened base of groups to be working with. So not to say that there would be no overhead in the DFI investment, but that a lot of the coaching, the capacity building, the long-term support that you need to build up that base is happening at the aid level, and that the investment is capitalizing on what's already being invested in from the aid side. So we can see those kind of models. I take our colleague's point on the issue of the burden of requirements of reporting and proof that is placed on the aid sector, and that understanding that it perhaps should be less for the DFI, but less overall. I think there's something that we're all facing in the development community, that we are really crushed by the administrative frameworks around aid, and I know there's a statement in the new assistance policy to say this needs to be addressed, because in our efforts to be more accountable, we're actually less effective.
Limited in my time, I want to get Mr. Medora's comments on the inevitable costs, increased costs of smaller loans, effectively.
Yes, indeed. And it also ties into the previous exchange on local know-how. If you want to be effective in the development sphere, you need on-the-ground expertise. So if you have a $50 million, $60 million a year operation, then how are you going to get the local nuance? Is it going to be by being in Montreal, or is it going to be by having a network of informants and professional staff around the world? It's likely the latter, and the more you do of the latter, the higher is the overhead. And so I think the small size is fine, as several of us might be saying, to begin, but this is not a long-term sustainable model. In the long term, there is going to have to be a different sort of ratio, and the only way to change that ratio is not having even fewer staff, but by having larger and larger lending activities. Now, on the question of how does one identify these, and is it easier by tacking on to existing priorities, I could make a case for you either way. I think the case that my colleague from Oxfam made about if you empower a women's rights organization, somehow we also gain knowledge about women's entrepreneurship activities is a good one. but then it's going to require a coordination between the aid officials who reside in GAC and the development finance officials who reside in EDC. And frankly, it's not readily apparent to me that empowering women's rights organizations will lead to better market information about women's-led entrepreneurship. So I could just as well be comfortable saying, let the banking folks identify opportunities, be it infrastructure, be it startups in new technology, through other channels, and come up. Because if everything is homogenous, where do the new ideas come from? And that was also the same relationship between the former CEDA and IDRC. IDRC did not do absolutely everything CEDA did for a reason. That's where the experimentation happened, that's where the risks were taken, and if something works, you then scale it up, and it became CEDA. I'd make the same kind of case for this in the case of the DFI, that the DFI selects sectors that might not be in Canada's mainstream, and then let them grow, and it may be that over time, an area like using blockchain technology for democratic development, which is not in our current ODA priorities, might become an ODA priority because of something small and interesting and successful that the DFI did 10 years previously.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. McKay. Colleagues, that'll wrap it up for this hour, and I want to thank Mr. Medora and Ms. Rhodes and Madame Revand from Oxfam and the Center for International Governance Innovation. This was a very good discussion, very helpful. There's a lot of interest in just where this goes as a new DFI. At some point, we're going to have to talk a little bit more about the effectiveness of a DFI that has a very small budget and what that means, and whether, in fact, this is the first tranche of a strategy of the government, because you would be limited to some extent when you compare yourself to other DFIs, if we can do that, comparing apples and apples. So on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you very much for your presentations, and if there's any other information that you think this committee should have a look at, feel free to send it on to us. Colleagues, we're going to suspend for 5 and set up for our next witnesses, and we'll go from there. Thank you. We'll have to get back into session. As you know, we're tight schedule as normal. Before us today is the Mennonite Economic Development Associates. Jeremy Quigley, Senior Vice President. He's on the video conferencing in front of you. And we have Jesse Green, who is with the Développement International des Jardins. Thank you for coming this morning. We'll start with Ms. Green, and she'll make her presentation, and then we'll go to Mr. Quigley, and then we'll go right into questions. Try and keep it as fairly tight as possible. We wouldn't mind having a few minutes to talk to you about other matters before we call it a day here and talk about next week. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Ms. Green, and she can start. And then the normal practice, we'll go to questions after your short presentation. Ms. Green, the floor is yours.
Bonjour. Merci, Monsieur le Président, committee members. So I'm very pleased to be here today to support the committee in its study of the Development Finance Initiative. Développement International Desjardins is part of Desjardins Financial Group. It was established in 1970 as a not-for-profit organization, and its goal initially until today is to share Desjardins' experience working in the financial sector and in the cooperative financial sector with institutions in developing countries. So nowadays, DID works with a broad range of financial actors in developing countries. And our goal is to improve access to quality financial services. And since 2009, what we've been doing is we've been working especially with entrepreneurs, we've been launching these financial institutions, or SME finance institutions, in 5 different countries, in Africa and Latin America, which we funded with support from GAC, Global Affairs Canada, as well as DFIs and private investment. In fact, in these SME finance institutions, we've been working with 7 DFIs, so this is over the last 8 years, just to give you a perspective on our experience with DFIs. They've provided about $21 million in support, a combination of grants, so about 30% of that is technical assistance grants, and then we have some debt and some equity. So my comments today are very much from the co-investor perspective, working together with DFIs, as well as client perspective, because we have received funding from DFIs. So there are many advantages to working with DFIs. They're patient investors. They tend to take more risk than private investors. We can often get larger amounts from DFIs than from private investors. They tend to be the ones who stay when things go less well. So in an economic downturn, private funding tends to disappear, whereas DFI funding will often stay. And they provide investments in local currency, which we find essential in developing countries. In fact, when we, DID, make investments in exotic currencies, we use an agency called TCX, which is a hedging agent for exotic currencies. And that didn't exist before. It was, in fact, set up by a group of DFIs. So there are many advantages to working with DFIs, but there are also some disadvantages, or challenges, let me say. They tend to be a little inflexible and bureaucratic. So, our experience is that it's very difficult to obtain smaller investments from DFIs. When we started launching institutions in sub-Saharan Africa, we just needed small investments. We were looking for less than a few $1 million. And DFIs told us that was just way below their minimum ticket size. Most of them would start at $7 million or higher. So that makes it almost impossible for startups and for innovative new initiatives to find funding from DFIs. So we think it would be helpful for the DFI to reserve a part of its budget for smaller transactions or for investing in startups. Working with DFI sometimes involves long delays and complicated legal negotiations. Just to give you an example, it took us 3 years to negotiate an investment, a relatively small equity investment with a DFI quite recently. 3 years. So we think it would be very innovative for the DFI to have a bit of a lighter touch, especially when it comes to smaller investments. And thinking a little bit outside of the box, when Desjardins' private equity investment team wanted to make their services more appealing to SMEs or to entrepreneurs, what they did is they replaced their standard 40-page shareholder agreement, which always involved years of negotiations, with a 4-page shareholder agreement. And this was, it's completely revolutionary. If a DFI would do something like this, it would be a small revolution. So we would hope to see a flexible DFI that has the possibility to be at least flexible with a part of its budget, and we believe this would allow for innovation. On the question of how the DFI should measure outcomes, I very much agree with Mr. Medora, who spoke before, saying that, in fact, we shouldn't seek to measure outcomes. Outcomes can only be measured in a controlled environment where we know all the variables. And for an investor, that's impossible. So we believe that the DFI should be requested or required to report on its outputs, on its activities, and we want to ensure that the conditions are in place to create the desired outcomes. But it wouldn't be realistic to ask an investor to measure outcomes from our point of view. So we're very pleased with the establishment of the DFI, but we are concerned that this could lead to the perception that the government shouldn't engage in any other kind of investment for development. We see the DFI as being part of a continuum. So on the one side, we have pure aid. At the other end, we have pure investment. And in between, there can be a mix of the two in this kind of continuum. And although Global Affairs Canada is not currently enabled to invest in initiatives that are for profit, we would love to see that in the future. And we think that would allow for investments that are more risky and in countries where perhaps the DFI wouldn't be able to invest. So we hope that the government will continue to develop a wide range of complementary development tools where riskier investments could be done, for example, by GAC, and then perhaps the DFI could combine some of its investments with donations for capacity development, because we think that would be very helpful in riskier sectors such as agricultural finance. So we certainly respect and agree with the need for the DFI to be autonomous. But we do believe that if the DFI is to distinguish itself internationally, it is essential for it to work in complementarity in some way with the other Canadian development actors. So IDRC, GAC, civil society. I mean, this would be the ideal way for the DFI to really show its complementarity to Canada's development strategies. And so we believe this could be done at least with a part of its portfolio. So there's been a lot of discussion about blended finance, where public funding is leveraged to attract private funding. Obviously, the simplest and most common way of doing that, which DFIs do often, is to subordinate their investment to the investments of private investors. But we don't think that that's the only way. And we've seen many different kinds of structures which we believe could be called blended finance. And that could be considered blended finance as well. And in fact, why not think of a structure where Canadian investors or Canadian persons, citizens, could invest in the DFI or buy shares in the DFI? To me, that would be a truly innovative case of blended finance.
Thank you, Ms. Green. We'll go to Mr. Quigley, please. Just a second, Mr. Quigley, I don't think you're on. We'll try and see if we can pick you up here.
Okay. Good morning.
Okay, I think you're on, Mr. Quigley.
Okay, good morning. First of all, thank you to the committee for the opportunity to submit today. And greetings from Waterloo, Ontario. We appreciate your facilitating this by internet. And good morning, Jesse, who we know well. We respect Desjardins quite a bit. So my name is Jerry Quigley. I'm Senior Vice President for Mennonite Economic Development Associates, also called MEDA. And I would like to start very simply with 3 contextual comments on the DFI, and then go to 2 recommendations, I guess we would call them, that MEDA would make. So the first contextual comment is that MEDA generally supports the creation of a Canadian DFI, and we congratulate the current government for seeing this important initiative through. The second contextual comment is that at the initial $300 million over 5 years, we believe that this DFI is too small to try and act like other DFIs. OPIC is investing about $1.6 billion annually. CDC has net assets of somewhere in the neighborhood of almost $5 billion. To me, meaningful, the Canadian DFI at that level must be bold. I read somewhere, the third contextual comment is I read somewhere that this is the first DFI to be created in the last 20 years. 20 years is a lot of time to learn. So what have we learned? And what can we do that is new? On to the recommendations. MEDA believes that there is really no better place to start than a recent quote from the Canadian International Development Platform Group, and I quote, "Development impact and additionality should be at the top of the mandate. The DFI must work complementarily with Canada's wider development strategy." And that's a comment that can be found in the recent CIDP publication called "How Can Canada Deliver? Responding to the Changing Global Development Context." So first, to their comment about additionality. Other countries agree and acknowledge that Canada is an innovative global leader in the area of blended finance. We hear that all the time in the US and the UK. The DFI offers an excellent opportunity for Canada to grow that reputation and that work. The world does not need another baby DFI that competes with other DFIs and with private capital for low-risk, high-impact investments in low-income countries. Doing so, or trying to do so, would make it a lightweight, pale duplicate of what all the other DFIs are doing. The world does need a DFI that acts as a catalyst to private capital. Think CMHC. It's not a perfect example in the development space, but it does make a point. CMHC does not offer mortgages in competition to private lenders, but it does take on risk that allows private capital to flow where it otherwise would not. This should be a focus of the DFI. If the DFI can truly catalyze private capital, the result can be innovative, it can be transformative, and it can be catalytic. We will know the Canadian DFI is successful by how much private capital it crowds in. Other DFIs are criticized for competing with private capital. And that is why we think the DFI must be linked to Global Affairs Canada's new Office for Innovative Finance. The combined result should be bold, it should be different, and it should be disruptive, doing things that no other DFI is doing. That means it probably won't have the lofty returns of its contemporaries in other countries, but it will make a bigger difference. Second is the issue of development impact. Given its size, the DFI might consider sectoral or geographic focus. For instance, it would be innovative to de-risk private capital for investments in environmental infrastructure or women-led businesses or health. However, in development, there are always trade-offs. We know that. More narrow focus may undermine greater additionality, keeping in mind that there's an inverse relationship between the willingness of private capital to participate and the narrowness of the opportunity. Narrow field of investment is one factor in risk. For instance, investments in the health sector in East Africa is a very small pool, but the DFI also has very few resources with which to fish. So maybe it needs to be selective. That said, the DFI is new and therefore has a window of opportunity to shape itself to achieve greater impact in a smaller space. And the next comment is aligned with that of Desjardins. The DFI should consider working with Global Affairs Canada to offer sidecar technical assistance to augment and enhance its investments. MEDA's In-Front project confirmed that many businesses want to do the right thing. In-Front is a pioneering Global Affairs Canada funded blended finance project with $15 million of de-risking capital from the Canadian government, paired with $5 million in technical assistance to the businesses that are investee companies. We have found that most in-front private business owners are genuinely concerned about issues such as poverty, the environment, and women's participation. The DFI will quickly learn that the impact of its investments can be greatly enhanced with targeted additional support from Global Affairs Canada to the investee companies. Finally, it's good to see that Canada's new ODA policy supports such approaches. I quote two things from the new policy. First of all, new instruments such as repayable contributions will be introduced that will better enable Canada to mobilize new streams of financing for underserved private sector partners in developing countries, including women-led businesses. And second, from the recently released policy, Canada's contributions will also be leveraged by expanding and enhancing the options to contribute to initiatives through funding relationships that present a mix of repayable and non-repayable support. It just needs to do it in a meaningful way in collaboration with the new DFI. So thank you for this opportunity this morning to share our views on the DFI, and I turn it back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Quigley, and I like the start of this discussion, because one of the things that we are very interested in is, if we're going to be a new DFI, well, what does it mean to be bold, and what does it mean to be higher risk? We would like to see the witnesses sort of reflect on that. Does that mean a lower return instead of the 7% people talk about? Does it mean 4%? I mean, these are discussions that need to be had. Canada, I'm sure, would like to lead the world. So I start this conversation by sort of have people think a little bit about that, because if we're going to make recommendations to the government, I think we're going to have to touch on those particular areas. So I think you started off in a very good space yourself and Ms. Green. And so I'll turn it over to Mr. Allison to start off with the questions. Mr. Allison, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses, thanks for being here today. Mr. Quigley, I'm going to start with you. My thought process is we look at a DFI, it's just another tool in the toolkit in terms of what we could do. We do great things when it comes to humanitarian relief, disaster relief, vaccinations, all these kinds of things. My personal thought has always been, though, if we don't create economic activity, if we don't create jobs or find a way for some of the things that we do to be sustainable and work as part of that stuff, that we end up, that's one of the spokes in the wheel, if you will, in trying to make sure that everything happens. We can educate people, we can get them healthy, but if they don't have work at the end of the day, we still have a vicious cycle that continues. And that's why I like a DFI, for the potential that I think that can create. You talked about acting as a catalyst for private capital. Would you talk about that a bit? I know that we've had some people say $50–60 million a year is not enough. We may need to float bonds. We may need to do other things. I like the idea of being a catalyst for private capital, but just explain or give us your thoughts on what you mean by that, if you could expand on that.
Sure. Let me do that by giving you an example that already exists in the Canadian development space. This project that I was talking about, Infront, which stands for Impact Investing in Frontier Markets, is a Canadian-funded project that does actually provide incentive to the private investors to make their investments. And these incentives are in three forms. The first is that it takes the first loss. This is Canadian government money that takes first loss. If the private investors in these investments overseas, if there's a loss, Canadian government takes first. The second is that it doesn't take any upside on its investment. So you guys talked about how much is the right amount of return. On this particular one, it's zero return. That's probably too little. But that's another example of why other private investors, to the tune of $260 million, were willing to come in to this investment fund. This investment fund was sold about 4 years ago, and the industry resounded with a lot of private capital. We're trying to do the same thing with a current fund where there is no Canadian government support, or there is no Canadian government de-risking facility in that fund. In that fund, we're having a very, very difficult time selling to private investors because private investors are frankly afraid of investing in these frontier markets. So it's an example of when Canada did de-risk, private capital flowed in. When Canada didn't help to de-risk, it was much, much harder to raise private capital. So that's an example.
Thank you, and I guess that's part of the challenge, right? When we're trying to go back to taxpayers and sell them on the benefit of this, realizing that the government or their taxpayers' dollars may take the first hit. I realize you said that was just an example, not the only one, but those are the things we also have to balance off as well, and that's why I like maybe a more reasonable rate of return, but still some there. And let's go to Ms. Green around the same thing, because you guys have partnered with some DFIs, and I love what Desjardins does with microfinance as well. So I think those are important tools. I think the challenge around some of these things is managing those programs on the ground. So talk a bit about, you talked about making it simpler to be able to participate with the DFI. So just why don't you expand on that a bit? And I realize that if you're talking about a 40 or 50-page shareholder agreement, these kinds of things, 3 years to get a deal done. So talk to us a bit more about what you have in mind.
The main complication working with DFIs tends to be that they have very heavy legal departments. So this legal heavy approach just doesn't work very well when we have local partners. We're working with organizations. We invest in microfinance or financial inclusion institutions in different countries. And they're having a fantastic impact on the ground, but they maybe have one legal advisor. They work maybe with an external company. So when a DFI comes with a 50-page loan agreement, they'll just sign and not understand everything that's in there, all the consequences that it can have. But this is not a development approach. Like, this is an institution trying to cover all the bases for every possible legal eventuality in a country where really the legal system, it's not Canada, let's say. So, just thinking practically, looking at the reality on the ground, if you want to work with local partners, you have to adapt to the local situation and to local capacity. And if an institution is not willing to do that, it will have to work with large international institutions who then have their own partners on the ground. So in our case, we often do that for our partners. So if a DFI is interested in investing, for example, together with us, we would, try to act as the legal interpreter in between the two. But the reality on the ground is that this legal heavy approach is just, it's not realistic.
Go to
Thanks.
Mr. Sandy, please.
Good morning to you both. Mr. Quigley, I'm the Member of Parliament for Kitchener Centre, so I had the opportunity to visit the MEDA offices last year. And some of the things that I took away from that visit was the long-term nature of the investment that MEDA had. And there was one particular project that you were involved in, and I'm sorry if I don't remember the country correctly. I think it was a dairy plant in Guatemala, which I believe was a 15 to 19-year investment. So can you sort of give an idea, because you're actually practicing, in investments in areas which require that, and how do you decide what the project parameters will be, and how do you determine the length of the commitment to that project?
Well, first of all, thank you, and we appreciate your representation of Kitchener, and thanks for visiting our office. The investment that you're talking about was actually in Paraguay. It was a dairy, so your memory on that is great. And it speaks to the history of MEDA. MEDA started 65 years ago as an investment fund. It was an investment fund of about 10, at that time, Mennonite businessmen. They were all men at that time, who thought that development should be done in a different way. They didn't really call it development at that time. They just wanted to help in South America. And so they all invested their own money into a pool. That pool was used to invest in a number of businesses in Latin America. And these members actually went down and mentored. They gave advice. They gave their own money. And they did it all from an investment perspective. So this was the history of MEDA. And I think what you're referring to there is that those original 1956 dollars still, when they're returned, they still exist in MEDA. We have them as part of a capital pool that we continue to use to this day. I wanted to quickly make the point that when the Canadian public says, why should we invest in why should we underwrite the investment of for instance, private entrepreneurs in these areas, part of the answer to that is because this money stays around. It doesn't get spent. It gets used very, very productively, and then it's returned, and it can be used again. And I think that's very powerful. How do we decide on how long? I think that's very, very case specific. It's contextual. We are invested in investment funds. We invest in investment funds for very long periods of time because the investment fund lasts for 15 years, for instance. It's a fixed term investment fund. But we also invest in banks and microfinance institutions with short-term capital for 1 year, 18 months. So that's a very contextual question. It depends on the issue that we're trying to deal with.
And Ms. Green, you talked about sectoral or geographic forms of investment, and the question I have is that when you're making investments, so let's take banking for an example. I know this has happened in India, where there's a lack of rural banking, there's a lack of banking in rural areas. So what they've done is they've tried to give everybody Interact card to make it easier. But the problem is you still require certain infrastructure on the ground before you can utilize those services. So what is the interplay between ODA and DFI? Like how do you balance that? Because there's certain things that the official development assistance will have to do prior, or there has to be an infrastructure there prior before certain services can be brought. So how do you balance the two?
Well, thank you. I think that's a very good point and a dilemma, or one of the challenges of investing for development. The thing is with microfinance is it's been around for quite a long time, and there was a lot of, or there were many grants were made in throughout the world in emerging countries to help bring up microfinance. Initially, it wasn't seen as something that you would invest in because the infrastructure was built up. Eventually, they created investable institutions that are profitable and that offer great quality services to their members or clients, and eventually we could invest in them. But it takes a long time to build up that infrastructure, and often what we see now is that in new sectors or in the new geographical areas where these institutions don't exist, now investors come in, and without kind of having this in mind, that there was such a long history of building up that infrastructure initially with grants. And that's why we believe in the need to combine the two. So, for example, in agricultural finance, the returns are terrible at the moment in developing countries, even in developed countries, really. And you need to create this whole infrastructure with agricultural insurance and capacity building for farmers using the right inputs. It's quite a complicated system where just investment isn't enough. So that's why we advocate for a combination of the two where needed. And there will be sectors where, yes, the infrastructure is in place, very investable, good returns, but we'd like to see a portfolio approach where at least some of the funds from the DFI are reserved for these more innovative sectors where some donations will still be necessary.
Mr. Quigley, any comments?
No, I would agree that, I don't mean to generalize, but the work of investment is more risky and more difficult the further into poverty that you want to reach. And I think that requires creative and innovative approaches, and we would very much agree with Desjardins on this issue, that such as mixes of investment and technical assistance or grant dollars.
Thank you.
We're going to go to Mr. Aubin, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur. Merci à nos invités.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I'll begin with you, Ms. Green, because there's something you said in your preliminary remarks which really resonated with me, and it has to do with the creation of a DFI. You said that you were happy about it, but you had concerns. Now, when the Canadian government is going to invest in a DFI, but it's been putting the brakes on its ODA, might we ask questions? Look, you're taking these investments and sending them somewhere else instead of using this concept of additionality. Well, thank you, and I totally agree with what you've said. What we don't want to see, and what we're happy to learn, is that the government will not be using funds earmarked for funding a DFI. These are monies that will be added to the budget, but one does not replace the other. It's an additional system, but what we'd like to see is that the budget, the percentage of the budget for this area would go up instead of down. My second question has to do with both witnesses. We hear people in the Canadian government say that they want to be world leaders with their FDI or DFI, which has a relatively modest budget. Now, a world leader, should it not have a DFI with the capacity to distinguish itself from the other DFIs planet-wide? I might ask Mr. Quigley to answer first, please.
I agree that it's a small amount, and it needs to be have a way to distinguish itself. And I can think of no better way than the blended finance leadership that Canada took over the past 5 years on the international stage. That is in my opinion, the answer to how this DFI can be innovative.
Souhaitez-vous ajouter, Mme Green?
Would you like to add anything, Madam? Well, it certainly is quite a challenge to distinguish oneself given that there's a reduced budget and that there's this necessity to be profitable as soon as possible. If there's a very clear mandate with areas where you would concentrate that are very clear, then the DFI could distinguish itself in certain sectors. Well, is this like a big bank and small investments? Well, perhaps. But if the DFI only concentrates on small investments, it'll have its overhead, which will be higher. My point of view as an investment manager is to have a clear mandate and distinguish oneself, concentrate in one or two or three sectors rather than all kinds of sectors. I don't think that would work. I also remarked the fact that Desjardins' civil engagement or engagement as a citizen in this DFI, do you have an idea of civic engagement or citizen engagement in the DFI? Because this might lead to a model which is not, which is removed from charity, but which would be helpful nonetheless. Well, the Dutch work with FMO. It's half government, half bank. On the other hand, there are various European funds which allow far more risk with respect to retail banking. There are various funds in Europe, in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Holland. And these are funds that can be invested in various countries, and there are certain tax breaks. And this is one of the things we're looking at when we are looking what we can come up with as a product, because we have a great pool of staff who are interested in investing in development. But in Canada, there is no structure that would allow for this. My dream is to have a model that would allow, perhaps through DFI or another entity, this kind of partnership. Now, what about a citizen who wants to invest part of his pension fund in something like this, and there would also be an attractive tax deduction? Well, we have to be able to structure a fund so that there are attractive returns, and there should be, I think, tax benefits in order to help out. What we see in Europe is that citizens aren't acting for high-performing investments. They just want to get back their capital. There is Kairos in the United States, which takes people's money and invests it in microfinance projects. There are more and more people every year who are lending money, and they know what institution, they get information. They know what institution is going to get the money or what woman is going to get the money as microfinancing for a business. And they find this extremely gratifying and gratifying enough to take a risk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for your pretty engaging remarks this morning. My question would be the issue of accountability and good governance practices in the context of public-private partnership, such as in the case of proposed DFI. Last Tuesday at the committee meeting, we discussed that DFI haven't been immune to controversy, like the investment in at a shopping center in Nigeria. That project doesn't really appear to be sincere poverty-reducing initiative. And now the question is, how can accountability measures to be enforced with the private sector to ensure that projects at a fundamental level serve a development purpose? I'll go with you, Ms. Green, first.
I mean, I agree that no institution will be immune to controversy, and in fact, should allow for some degree of failure, and in fact, sharing its failures. So to me, the most interesting kind of accountability, besides reporting on outcomes, activities, which it should do, of course, would be to share failures, because this is something that we rarely see in development, and from DFIs either. I would be so pleased to see a DFI share its failures. You know, this is something that's kind of taboo in development, but very common in investment. You know, private equity actors know that if they invest in 10 companies, you know, the theory is that 2 will fail, 6 will be kind of middling, and 2 will outperform and make for a good return in the fund. But in development, we never say, like, we're going to have 10 projects, 2 will fail, 6 will be kind of average, and 2 will be great. You know, so this is kind of a discussion that I would strongly encourage the DFI to have.
Mr. Quigley.
Very good question. How do we make sure that our investments are responsible is basically the question I think you're asking. We just completed a due diligence of a bank in Ukraine, and that was a 60-page due diligence report that came out of that. I would argue that although the countries and the societies and the legal framework in the countries that we're working in are less advanced and less mature in terms of their legal and regulatory framework than in North America, that the investments that are made through DFIs and through organizations like Meade and Desjardins are subject to an intense amount of scrutiny and an intense amount of analysis, even more so, I would argue, than some of the investments in North America, which I suggest are designed to offset the lesser regulatory environment in these countries. But be assured that when you're working in this area with DFIs and presumably with the new Canadian DFI and with private sector investments, that they are subject to intense amounts of analysis to make sure that they are environmentally sound, that they're reaching to the right places, and to the extent possible that they're not putting people at undue risk.
Either of you can use an example of where DFI projects has been instigated and what the project should look like?
Well, I will I'll jump in and then let Jesse take over from there. We currently, for example, have an investment as part of a project we manage in Kenya. And as part of that project, we have an investment of $2 million into a company called Business Partners International. This is a company that turns around and takes that money and makes it available to small-sized companies. We're talking companies in the range of 50,000 to 150,000 or 200,000 in terms of equity or net worth. Involved in that investment are all of the DFIs that you could check off on your fingers. FMO is involved, World Bank, IFC is involved, EBRD is involved as an investor. So this is an example of a practical example of where Canadian government money is merging with that of existing DFIs, making it available to small-sized companies in Kenya to great effect.
It is, okay. That's great.
Well, I have lots of examples in mind, but you know, one of the DFIs, which I think is doing very good work right now in Central Asia, is EBRD. There's been a very difficult economic situation in recent years in Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, several other countries. And what EBRD has done, whereas private capital flows have disappeared and also many DFIs have stopped investing, EBRD continued to invest in local currency, even though the currencies are very risky at the moment, and while providing technical assistance grants to help institutions manage risk. So they're focusing on risk management to help institutions overcome the economic difficulties while also providing capital when capital is dried up. So that's definitely additionality for a DFI.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sidhu. Mr. Fragascatos, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I wonder if you could go back, Ms. Green, and talk about some of the decisions that Desjardins makes when it comes to prioritizing investment and some of the factors that weigh on your decision making. Why particular countries over others? And when you look at addressing issues in, well, certainly, you know, this is good corporate citizenship that we're seeing here on the part of Desjardins. Is it poverty reduction that's at the top of the list? And how do you measure poverty reduction? I brought that up earlier, but I think it's central to the discussion here.
Thank you. That's a good question. So how we choose our countries, basically what we're looking for are countries where access to finance is low. We're a small investor on the global scale in microfinance. There's some very large funds investing these days. So what we're looking for is our countries where access to finance is low. There's an excellent database created by the World Bank called the Findex. They surveyed 1,000 people in every country, and they've made this database where you can see the percentage of access to credit, to formal accounts, and it's very detailed according to women, men, regions, all kinds of financial products. So we use this database, first of all, to target specific countries where the need is higher, maybe not highest, but you know, for example, I mentioned Tajikistan. 5% of people there have access to a formal savings account. So we believe that the need is high. And, you know, this is a social impact opportunity, but also a business opportunity, because if 95% of people don't have access to finance, surely some of them would need some access. Whereas in Canada, access to a formal savings account, just to give a comparison, is 97%. So it's, you know, that's gives you an idea of what percentage of people would like to have access. On the question of poverty reduction, so there have been many, of course, microfinance started out, well, especially in the 90s, early 2000s, there was a lot of focus on microfinance is for poverty reduction, or microfinance reduces poverty. And this leads to a very strong demand then to prove it. But everyone needs financial services. We all use financial services. We need loans to finance our homes. We need homes to go to school. But it's very difficult to prove that the fact that I have access here to financial services helps me to get out of poverty. So it's been equally difficult to prove this as the determining factor that helps people get out of poverty. Countries may be developing, some people are more entrepreneurial than others. And the truth is financial services can also be harmful because if you get into too much debt, if you get different loans from different institutions, that could lead to over-indebtedness, and we heard even about suicides in India. And then people turn around and say, how could you say that this led to poverty reduction? It led to suicides. So I think it's quite risky to say financial services lead to poverty reduction. They lead to economic development. That we know for sure. And we shouldn't have to prove every time and again, that financial services are useful to people. So that's just one example where, I don't think the focus should be on proving every time that you did an action and that led to poverty reduction, because there are too many factors involved in poverty. Even as you mentioned before, poverty is very complex. It's not just GDP. It's not just access to education or health. So we believe that we have to put in place the factors to ensure that poverty reduction will occur. But we shouldn't have to prove them every time.
Thank you very much. Short question, please. Okay, then I'll go to Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, thoughts on this whole debate, actually. I think it's so crucial to the discussion that I'll continue to focus on it. Thoughts on how we ought to define poverty here. And I'll be very frank, I think poverty is more than not having money in one's pocket. There's all sorts of other measures that we need to look at if we're going to be serious about addressing poverty through a DFI or through development policy in general terms. What is your position on this? And it's
well, on the definition of poverty?
Sure, yeah. How should we measure poverty? How should we define it, and how should we measure it? Because if this is going to be included in the mandate of a DFI, a Canadian DFI, then I think it really speaks to this is about basic principles here.
Sure. Poverty reduction. There are many forums and many calculations. Definitions of poverty. Does it mean less than the purchasing power and less than 150 US per day of income? There's many different measurements, and I would obviously agree with you that they're not all equal, and they're not all very indicative of the meaningful change in people's lives that I think we're all trying to achieve. Let me just explain. I think the crux of your question is how do we measure poverty reduction relative to investment? And that's more difficult, perhaps, than in terms of a direct intervention. So I'm agreeing with you on that. The measurement of poverty relative to investment is much more difficult. You can measure at the level of the investment. You can measure whether they're creating jobs. You can measure whether they have policies in place that empower women in the business. You can measure whether they have environmental policies and procedures in place. Those are all kinds of things that are very important to the abolishment of poverty. But they don't answer, does it change the lives of people in the communities that they serve? And MEDA is working with the University of Waterloo to try. I mean, that's a question not only for MEDA or Desjardins or the Canadian government in the establishment of the DFI. It's the question that everybody is asking in this development impact investing space is how do we measure impact? If you're calling it impact investing.
Mr. Quigley, I don't mean to cut you off, but I have the sense I have about 15 seconds left before the chair intervenes.
Okay,
so should we should we make it a point of having a diverse approach when it comes to this as far as the DFI is concerned, so that middle-income countries are invested in because poverty exists there, and also not ignore LDCs because poverty obviously exists there? My understanding and everything that I've heard from the witness testimony today and in other meetings that we've had would indicate that we have to have a broad approach and not limit ourselves to either, but to proceed in a way that's going to address poverty and development concerns in general terms.
What we'll do is, Mr. Quigley, is ask you to give us a short yes or no, because we want to go to Mr. Kemiec before we wrap up.
Well, very quickly, I would take the opposite no. I would say it should be less broad than more broad because you don't have a lot of money.
Thank you. Mr. Kemiec, please.
How much time do I have?
5.
5 minutes? Very kind of you. Madame Green, je voulais vous demander, vous avez parlé des banques de commerce.
Ms. Green, I wanted to ask, you've talked to various banks, commercial banks. Can you describe how this works, working with banks? And what kind of fiscal treatment do they get, and what can taxpayers use as deductions? Well, the system I know best is in Holland, where the Dutch government created a tax benefit for institutions who would establish funds that would allow citizens to invest in impact investments, not necessarily development. It could be environmental. And there were 4 funds that were created by various banks. There is the ASN, different banks, and these are mutual funds, so anyone, any citizen, can buy shares, and the funds are spent according to the mandate. And this is in order to obtain a tax benefit. So it's ASN, that's the bank that has mutual funds. You can buy shares in those funds, and the fund is about 70 billion euros. But now the tax benefit has been removed. At one point, people could deduct just so much, whatever, the interest, so forth. But now they remove the tax benefit, and contributions have not fallen. They've continued to increase. But it gave that necessary first impulse, and then it just continued on. Another question. For the projects you decide to invest in, how do you decide on what kind of risk you're willing to take? You're saying we'll maybe take a risk on 25% because some 25% in equity involved in a project. And do you do it per specific project, or is it in the mandate? Is it defined in the mandate just how much risk you can take? Let's say, what would be the maximum? Do you decide by region or by project? Well, we invest with a part of our money. So we have risk limits in terms of the country, in terms of the instruments we use, and there's also a fund managed, and we have external investors like Desjardins and ASN, and they have very strict criteria. So we have to decide according to our own priorities what the limit will be. If it's an elaborate project, we might have to look at risks in terms of currency, the project, if it's a long-term project, etc. But it's about 60% in equity. So we do take a lot of risk, even compared to a lot of others.
I don't think so, Tom.
I don't think so. That's right.
I want to wrap this up, and because there's another committee coming in here in about 10 minutes, and I understand that they will have a minister with them as well. I want to thank both of our witnesses from Desjardins and from the Mennonite Economic Development Association. I think we lost Mr. Quigley. That's why we were seeing the full scale of Ms. Green. So on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you very much. It was a very interesting discussion this morning on DFI. Again, I go back to the conversation we've been having that this is the first new DFI in 20 years, and I think that's in itself is news that we're moving in a potentially a new, bold direction, and I like that discussion this morning for sure. So on behalf of the committee, thank you very, very much. And colleagues, have a good weekend in the riding, and we'll see you on Tuesday morning as usual. Meeting adjourned.